You couldn't afford real champagne, so I brought you something you'd recognize. Vanessa flicked her wrist. The drink hit Adrienne's face before 150 investors. Nobody moved. I didn't flinch. I reached for the napkin folded beside my plate and wiped my cheeks slowly, deliberately, like I had all the time in the world. That dress, Vanessa said, eyeing the plain navy fabric, is sweet. Did you borrow it for tonight? A few nearby investors laughed into their glasses. No one at the table said a word in my defense. They looked down at their plates, the particular silence of people who'd rather not be noticed agreeing. I set my napkin down, opened my clutch beneath the table, and sent one short text. Then I closed it again like nothing had happened. 11 years ago, I signed the paperwork that would one day make this exact company possible. Across the room, a junior associate named Talia paused mid-step, staring at the Gala's printed seating chart. The name beside Table 12 didn't match the badge. Honestly, Vanessa continued, louder now, playing to the table. People like her usually work these events, not attend them. Across the ballroom, Preston Holbrook's phone buzzed once in his tuxedo pocket. He didn't check it. Not yet. Someone at the next table leaned toward their neighbor. Wait, Colston, that name sounds familiar from the prospectus. There's clearly a clerical error, Vanessa said when a staffer mentioned the guest ledger. She waved the concern away without looking at it. Security drifted closer. I raised one hand slightly. Let her finish, I said quietly. She's not done yet. Only the reader could see it. A message glowing on a lawyer's phone 3 floors up. Confirmed. Standing by for your word. Preston glanced toward the stage, then toward his wife, some faint unease crossing his face that he couldn't yet name. Talia lifted her phone beneath her clutch and quietly photographed the wine stains still drying on my collar. Have her escorted out, Vanessa told the guard, not lowering her voice at all. She's clearly lost. The guard hesitated, scrolling the guest list on his tablet. Ma'am, he said slowly, her name's actually at the top. That can't be right, Vanessa snapped. She doesn't belong at this table, let alone at the top of anything. The board chair, Warren Doyle, crossed the room at last, drawn by the commotion, still uncertain who was in the wrong. Warren took the tablet, scanned the screen, and went very still. Colston Vantage Capital, he read aloud. Anchor investor. 22 years before that ballroom, I was answering phones at a community lending office in Memphis, filing loan applications for small business owners the big banks wouldn't touch. I remember the exact desk I sat at. Metal, dented at one corner, a space heater humming under my feet because the building's furnace never quite worked in winter. Nobody in that office thought I'd amount to much beyond that desk. I didn't think it either, not at first. I just kept noticing things, which applications got approved and which got quietly buried, which small businesses got a second look, and which got a form rejection letter without explanation. I started keeping my own notes. Nobody asked me to. I just couldn't stop. By 28, I'd used those notes to build a lending model nobody else at that firm had bothered to build. One that actually predicted which overlooked businesses would succeed if someone gave them a real chance. I brought it to my supervisor. He filed it in a drawer and told me to get back to answering phones. I didn't get angry. I got patient instead. Patience, I've learned, is the most underrated form of power there is. 6 years later, I'd raised my first fund using that model, $3 million from investors who believed in what I'd built long before anyone downtown did. Colston Vantage Capital started in a rented office above a dry cleaner. Nobody who mattered noticed us for the first 4 years. Holbrook Dynamics found their way to me 11 years ago, a small logistics software company burning through cash, one funding round away from folding entirely. I looked at their books for exactly 1 week. I saw what everyone else had missed. A company with genuinely sound technology being run by founders who didn't yet understand their own market. I wrote the check that kept the lights on. In exchange, I took Class B veto shares, the kind that don't show up on a stage banner, the kind that matter more than any single board seat. I never asked for public credit. I never needed it. What I needed, tonight, was something simpler, To walk into the room these people were about to take public, dress the way I dress when I'm not performing for anyone, and see exactly how they treated someone they assumed didn't matter. I already had my answer. 11 years of careful, quiet building, and Vanessa Hallbrook had just thrown a glass of wine directly into the middle of it. The gala wasn't an accident I'd stumbled into. I'd asked Preston's team for a seat at table 12 weeks earlier, under my full legal name filed quietly with the guest coordinator, but listed on the printed seating card as simply A. Colston, a habit I'd kept since my very first fund closing. People read what they expect to read. Nobody expects an anchor investor to be dressed the way I was tonight. Tomorrow morning, Hallbrook Dynamics would price its shares and go public. $340 million raised, a valuation north of $1.5 billion, and a roadshow that had taken 14 months to build. My firm held the single largest private stake in that company outside the founders themselves, and my veto rights meant that nothing about the final structure of that IPO happened without my signature. I told my team I wanted one final evening inside the room before the ink dried, not to check numbers. I already knew the numbers cold, but to watch. To see whether the culture Preston and Vanessa had built around this company matched the culture we'd want attached to our name for the next decade. I've done this before, at other companies, other galas, wearing other quiet dresses that told people nothing true about who was actually paying for the champagne in their glasses. Most nights, nothing happens. Most nights, I watch. I take notes, I go home, and the deal proceeds exactly as planned. Tonight was different only because Vanessa Hallbrook decided a woman in a modest navy dress, sitting quietly at table 12, must be someone's assistant, or somebody's plus one, or worse, someone who'd wandered in from the hotel staff by mistake. She never once considered that the woman she was mocking held the exact signature that would determine, within 12 hours, whether her husband's company opened on the exchange floor tomorrow morning at all. I didn't correct her. Not yet. I let her keep talking, the way I always do, because people reveal every true thing about themselves in the minutes before they realize who's actually listening. And I already knew, by the time that wine hit my cheek, that I had seen exactly what I came to see. Vanessa Hallbrook had married into Hallbrook Dynamics 18 years before it ever went public, back when Preston was running the company out of a 2-room office with 3 employees and a single overworked server rack. She liked to remind people of that, how she'd been there since the beginning, how she understood, better than any outside investor ever could, exactly what this company was supposed to be. What she understood, more precisely, was status. She had built her entire social identity around being the woman who sat at the head table, who chaired the investor relations committee in name only, who decided, usually correctly, in her mind, who belonged in her room and who didn't. 18 years of galas, roadshows, and golf club luncheons had taught her one lesson above all others. Confidence read as certainty, and certainty was rarely challenged out loud. She wasn't cruel by nature, not in the way people mean when they use that word carelessly. She was something more common and, in its own way, more dangerous, comfortable. Comfortable enough, after 2 decades of being right about who mattered in a room, that she'd stopped bothering to check. She'd looked at Adrienne's plain navy dress, her single worn gold watch, the absence of any visible jewelry, and made a judgment in under 4 seconds that she would spend the rest of the evening defending out loud, in public, in front of 150 people whose opinions determined whether her husband's company survived its first year as a public entity. Preston had warned her, more than once over the years, to be careful with new guests at these events. You never really know, he'd say, who's sitting at which table. She'd laughed it off each time. Tonight, for the first time in 18 years, that warning was about to matter. She didn't know yet that the woman she'd just publicly humiliated held veto power over the very deal being celebrated tonight. She didn't know that a junior associate 3 tables away had already quietly photographed the whole thing. She didn't know that somewhere upstairs, a lawyer's phone had already lit up once. She only knew that the room had gone quiet in a way she didn't recognize, and that the silence, for the first time all night, didn't feel like agreement. The wine had barely finished dripping off my chin when Vanessa raised her voice loud enough for 3 surrounding tables to hear clearly. "I don't know how she even got a seat back here," she said, "but someone should really check who's letting people wander in off the street." I set my napkin down and looked at her directly, not with anger, just steady attention, the way you look at someone whose next sentence you already know is going to matter later. "I check the guest ledger before you say anything else," I said quietly. She laughed, short and sharp. "Sweetheart, I chair investor relations for this company. I don't need to check anything." Talia, the young associate 3 tables away, had her phone angled low near her waist, capturing the exchange in careful, silent frames, not because anyone had told her to, but because something in her gut told her this moment would matter to someone, someday, even if she didn't yet understand who. Preston's phone buzzed a second time. This time, he glanced down. A single line from an unfamiliar contact saved simply as a CVC legal, confirming attendance of anchor investor at tonight's event. "Please advise if further discretion required." He read it twice. His stomach dropped somewhere between the second and third word. "Vanessa," he said, low, urgent, crossing the room quickly now. "Who exactly did you just—" She didn't hear him yet. She was still talking, still performing for the small crowd that had gathered near table 12, still certain, in the particular way people are certain right before the floor gives out beneath them, that she had done nothing wrong at all. "It's simple," she continued, raising her glass slightly, playing to her audience. "Some people just don't belong at the grown-ups table." I didn't raise my voice. I never do. I simply reached for my own phone, opened the single message waiting there from my legal team, and typed back one word. "Proceed." Behind me, Warren Doyle was already walking toward the guest ledger station, drawn by the small crowd and the strange tension radiating from table 12, still completely unaware of what he was about to read. I gathered my clutch, stood slowly, and smoothed the front of my dress where the wine had already begun to dry into a dark stain near the collar. I didn't wipe it away completely. I wanted it visible, at least for a little while longer. "Where are you going?" Vanessa asked, some of the certainty draining out of her voice for the first time. "Nowhere," I said. "I'm simply standing so everyone can see me clearly." Around us, the ballroom had shifted into a different kind of quiet. Not the polite hush of dinner conversation, but the tense, expectant stillness of a room that senses something is about to change and doesn't yet know what. Talia had moved closer, phone lowered now, but still recording, close enough that I could see the careful, deliberate way she was documenting everything. My face, the stain, Vanessa's raised glass, the guard's tablet still glowing in Warren's hands 20 feet away. Preston reached us first, his face pale in a way it hadn't been 10 minutes earlier. "Miss Colston," he said, and something in the careful way he said my full name told me he already understood exactly who I was. "I am so deeply sorry. This is not who we are as a company, isn't it?" I asked. "Because for the last 15 minutes, it's exactly who you've been." He didn't have an answer for that. Few people ever do, when the truth is laid out that plainly. Vanessa's laugh had disappeared entirely. She stood very still, glass still in hand, watching her husband apologize to a woman she'd spent the last quarter hour publicly humiliating, slowly beginning to understand that whatever was happening now was far bigger than one spilled drink. "Preston," she said quietly, "who is she?" He didn't answer his wife directly. He simply turned toward Warren, who was still standing near the ledger station, tablet in hand, his expression the particular mixture of shock and dawning comprehension that comes right before a room fully changes. "Warren," Preston said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Tell me that's not what I think it says." Warren looked up slowly. "It's exactly what you think it says." Warren Doyle turned the tablet so Preston could see it directly, his hands slightly unsteady, the first visible sign that even the company's own board chair understood the weight of what was written on that screen. "Colston Vantage Capital," he read aloud, slow and careful, like a man reading a verdict rather than a ledger entry. "Anchor investor. Class B Vito shares. 22% ownership stake." The number landed across the ballroom in ripples, table by table, as more and more guests leaned in to catch the words. 22% wasn't a passive position. It was, functionally, the difference between an IPO happening on schedule and an IPO not happening at all. That can't be right, Vanessa said, but her voice had lost every trace of the certainty it carried 10 minutes earlier. There's been some mix-up with the ledger. There's no mix-up, Warren said quietly. I confirmed it myself, twice, against the master filing we submitted to the SEC 3 weeks ago. He looked at me then, really looked, the way people look at someone once they've stopped seeing what they expected and started seeing what's actually standing in front of them. Ms. Colston, I owe you an apology on behalf of this entire board. I didn't need his apology yet. I needed something else first. Talia, I said, and the young associate startled slightly, surprised I knew her name at all. You've been documenting this evening rather carefully. I'd like copies of everything you have, time-stamped, sent directly to my legal team tonight. She nodded quickly. Yes, ma'am. Already saved. Vanessa's face had gone through several colors in the space of a minute. Flushed with irritation, then pale with dawning understanding, now something closer to gray. She set her champagne glass down on the nearest table with a small, unsteady clink. I didn't know, she said, quieter now, to no one in particular. How could I have known? You didn't ask, I said. That's different from not knowing. Around us, 150 investors who had spent the last 15 minutes watching in uncomfortable silence were now watching for an entirely different reason. Waiting, the way people wait when they sense a story is about to end very differently than it began. Someone near the stage said my name aloud, not as a question this time, but as a statement. That's Adrian Colston. And the words moved through the ballroom faster than any microphone could have carried them. I watched it happen in real time, the way recognition spreads through a crowded room. First the tables nearest us, then the ones beyond, a ripple of turned heads and lowered voices, until nearly every one of the 150 investors present understood, within the space of 90 seconds, exactly who had been standing quietly at table 12 all evening. Vanessa's face had gone completely still, the practiced social mask she'd worn all night finally, entirely gone. I want to apologize, she said, stepping toward me. I had no idea who. I know, I said. That's precisely the problem. Preston stood beside his wife, his expression somewhere between horror and calculation, already understanding that whatever happened in the next few minutes would determine far more than tomorrow's opening share price. Ms. Colston, please, whatever needs to happen to make this right, we will do it. Immediately. I didn't answer him right away. I let the silence stretch, the same way I always do, because I wanted every person in that ballroom to sit inside it a moment longer. 22% of this company, I said finally, loud enough for the tables around us to hear clearly, gives me veto rights over tomorrow's IPO structure. I intend to use them. A murmur moved through the crowd, sharp and immediate. Not to cancel it, I continued. To change it. Effective tonight, investor relations will be restructured under new, permanent oversight, with an anti-discrimination compliance clause written directly into the governance charter, reviewed by an independent board committee before markets open. I looked directly at Vanessa. And you will not be part of that department, starting tonight. Vanessa opened her mouth. Nothing came out. Preston, I added, quieter now. You built something worth investing in. That's the only reason I'm still standing in this room instead of walking out of it. The ballroom had gone almost entirely silent. 150 investors watching a woman who, 15 minutes earlier, had been publicly humiliated, now standing at the exact center of the room she'd just been told she didn't belong in. The truth of it settled over that ballroom slowly, the way truths that matter always do, not as a single explosion, but as a series of smaller realizations landing one after another. 22% ownership meant I wasn't merely an investor Hallbrook Dynamics wanted to keep happy. It meant, in practical terms, that I held the single largest private stake in a company about to be valued north of $1.5 billion, and that my Class B shares carried veto authority over any material change to the IPO structure, timeline, or governance. Authority the founding team had granted 11 years earlier. Back when $3 million from a small firm above a dry cleaner in Memphis was the only thing standing between Holbrook Dynamics and bankruptcy. Preston had known this, of course, on paper, in filings, in the abstract way people know facts about spreadsheets they haven't looked at closely in years. What he hadn't understood, what almost none of them had understood, was that the woman holding that authority had walked quietly into his company's biggest night, dressed the way she chooses to dress when she isn't performing for anyone, specifically to see how his culture treated someone it assumed didn't matter. He got his answer in 15 minutes flat. "I need everyone's attention," Warren Doyle said, stepping toward the small stage microphone, his voice carrying the particular gravity of a man who understood exactly how much was riding on the next few sentences. "Tonight's proceedings will be paused briefly while the board convenes an emergency session." A ripple of concern moved through the investors, the instinctive worry of people whose money was tied directly to tomorrow's opening bell. "The IPO will proceed as scheduled," Warren continued, glancing toward me once, as if confirming something silently before saying it aloud, "with immediate governance changes that our anchor investor has required, and that this board fully supports." I said nothing further. I didn't need to. The room had already understood everything it needed to understand, and Vanessa Holbrook, standing very still beside her husband, champagne glass abandoned on the table behind her, had finally run out of anything true left to say. By midnight, the ballroom had mostly emptied, but the real work of the evening was only beginning 3 floors above it, in a private boardroom where the company's directors had gathered on less than an hour's notice. I sat at the head of that table, not because anyone assigned me the seat, but because nobody in the room felt in a position to suggest otherwise. Preston sat across from me, his tie loosened, his earlier composure entirely gone. Warren sat beside him, still holding the tablet that had started all of this, though its screen had long since gone dark. "I want to be clear," I said, once everyone had settled, "that my intention was never to derail tomorrow's listing. I built this position over 11 years because I believed in what this company could become. That belief hasn't changed tonight." Relief moved visibly across several faces around the table. "What has changed," I continued, "is my patience for finding out, only after the fact, how this company treats people it assumes hold no power. Tonight wasn't the first time. Talia Osei documented tonight's incident in detail, but she also handed my team 3 prior complaints from junior staff about investor relations conduct, complaints that were filed and then quietly closed without action." The room went very still. "Those files exist," I said. "They'll be part of the independent review my firm is requiring before markets open." Preston nodded slowly, some of the color returning to his face now that a clear path forward had finally been laid out in front of him. "Whatever the review finds," he said, "we'll act on it. All of it." "I know you will," I said, "because the alternative is that I don't sign tomorrow's paperwork, and there is no IPO at all." Nobody at that table needed further explanation of what that would mean. Not for Holbrook Dynamics, not for the 14 months of work behind tomorrow's listing, not for the 1,400 employees whose options were tied directly to a market debut that was still, technically, entirely within my power to stop. I had no intention of stopping it. I only intended to make certain it opened onto something better than what I'd walked into tonight. Vanessa found me alone near the elevator bank an hour later, her emerald gown replaced by a plain coat, her earlier composure entirely stripped away. "I need you to know," she said, "that I've never done anything like that before." "Not really." I turned to face her fully for the first time since the ballroom. "I believe you've never been caught doing it before," I said. "That's different from never doing it." She flinched slightly, as if the distinction landed harder than any raised voice could have. "Preston is going to ask the board to remove me from investor relations entirely," she said. "I assume you already know that." "I do. Is there anything I can say that changes what happens next?" I considered the question honestly, because she deserved an honest answer, even one she didn't want to hear. "No," I said. "Not because I want to punish you specifically. Because an apology after the fact doesn't undo what almost happened to the next person who walks into a room like that one without a title anyone recognizes. The consequence isn't about tonight. It's about every night after this one. She nodded slowly, understanding, finally, something she'd spent 18 years avoiding. For what it's worth, she said quietly, I am sorry. I believe that too, I said. It just isn't enough to change what comes next. She didn't argue. She simply nodded once more, turned, and walked toward the parking garage elevator alone, her heels echoing against marble in a hallway that, an hour earlier, had still belonged entirely to her. I stood there a moment longer, watching the elevator doors close behind her, feeling none of the satisfaction people sometimes expect in moments like that. Just a quiet, settled certainty that something necessary had finally happened, 11 years later than it should have. My phone buzzed once more in my clutch. A message from Warren, compliance clause drafted. Board vote scheduled for 6 a.m. Thank you for staying tonight. I typed back a single word, the same one I always send when the work is finally, quietly done. Proceed. The independent review took 11 days. It found exactly what Talia's 3 buried complaints suggested it would, a pattern, not an isolated incident, of investor relations staff dismissing or mishandling guests and junior employees based on appearance, accent, or perceived status, spanning at least 4 years. Vanessa Holbrook was formally removed from her role within the week, not through a quiet resignation with a generous severance and a graceful public statement, but through a board resolution citing specific documented conduct filed as part of the company's public governance disclosures ahead of its now-completed IPO. Holbrook Dynamics issued a formal public apology within 72 hours of the gala, naming no individuals but acknowledging clearly that conduct inconsistent with our stated values occurred at a company-sponsored event and has been addressed through immediate personnel and governance changes. Financial journalists covering the listing noted the unusual speed and specificity of the response, the kind that typically only happens when the party demanding accountability holds real leverage. I made sure Talia's documentation was credited internally, in writing, as the evidence that initiated the review. She was promoted twice in the following year, first into a compliance role she'd quietly been advocating for since her first month at the company, and later into a position reporting directly to the new head of investor relations, a department now operating under an external oversight committee my firm had insisted upon. The 3 prior complaints that had been buried were reopened as well. 2 of the junior employees involved had already left the company by the time the review concluded. Both were contacted directly, offered formal apologies, and given the option of returning to positions with back pay if they chose. One did. One didn't, and I didn't blame her for that choice at all. None of this made headlines the way the Gala incident briefly had, in a handful of finance publications that ran short items about unusual governance demands from an anchor investor. That was fine with me. The parts that mattered most were never going to be the parts anyone outside that boardroom would ever read about. What mattered was that the next person who walked into a Holbrook Dynamics event wearing something unremarkable would be treated, at minimum, like someone worth being polite to, not because it was good publicity, but because the alternative now came with real, documented, enforceable consequences. Holbrook Dynamics opened on the exchange floor 11 days after that gala at a share price nearly 9% above its initial target range, a detail financial reporters attributed to renewed investor confidence following swift governance action. I never corrected that framing publicly, though it was only part of the truth. The larger part was this. I had spent 11 years building a reputation for being right about which companies deserve patient capital, and part of that reputation depended on making sure the companies I backed became places worth being right about. Not just financially, but in every smaller, quieter way that doesn't show up on a balance sheet, but shows up eventually in everything else. The compliance clause I'd required became a template. 2 other companies in my portfolio adopted nearly identical language within the year, unprompted, after their own boards reviewed what had happened at Holbrook Dynamics, and decided they'd rather build the safeguard proactively than discover its absence the way Preston had. I never asked Preston to publicly credit me for any of it, and he never did, not directly. But 6 months later, at Holbrook Dynamics' first shareholder meeting as a public company, I noticed something small in the printed governance report handed to every investor in the room. A footnote acknowledging the contributions of our anchor investor to strengthening this organization's culture and accountability structures. Small, quiet, exactly the kind of acknowledgement I'd always preferred. I set the report down on the table in front of me, the same kind of table I'd sat at 11 months earlier in a plain navy dress, waiting to see who this company really was underneath its polished roadshow presentation. I already had my answer that first night. What mattered more was what the company chose to become afterward, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, watching a company I'd built my patience around, I felt something close to genuine pride. Not because of the stock price, because of the footnote nobody outside that room would ever read carefully enough to understand what it actually cost to earn. Talia asked to meet with me privately about 8 months after the gala, nervous in a way that reminded me, gently, of myself at her age. We met in a small conference room, just the two of us, no agenda beyond whatever she wanted to say. I keep thinking about that night, she said. I didn't know who you were. I just knew something was wrong, and I didn't know what else to do except document it and hope it mattered eventually. It mattered, I said. It mattered more than almost anything else that happened that night. She looked down at her hands. I almost didn't take out my phone. I kept thinking, who am I to record this? I'm nobody at this company. You were the only person in that entire ballroom, I said, who decided that watching quietly wasn't enough. That's not nobody. That's precisely the kind of person organizations need and almost never reward in time. I told her, then, about the metal desk in Memphis, the space heater, the model I'd built that got filed away in a drawer for 6 years before anyone took it seriously. I told her because I wanted her to understand that the distance between where she was sitting that day and where I was sitting now wasn't talent or luck, exactly. It was patience applied consistently over a very long time to people who didn't yet see what she was capable of. I'm setting up a small fellowship, I told her, for early career professionals in industries like this one. People who notice things and act on them before anyone tells them they're allowed to. I'd like you to help me design it. She didn't say anything for a moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was steadier than it had been at the start of our conversation. I'd like that very much. I didn't need the fellowship to carry my name prominently, or at all, really. I needed it to exist, quietly, the way most of the things I've built over the years exist, doing their work in the background, largely uncredited, changing outcomes for people who will likely never know exactly why an opportunity appeared when it did. Some doors, I've learned, open loudest when nobody announces they're opening at all. A year after the gala, a business magazine ran a feature on Holbrook Dynamics' first year as a public company, focusing largely on its unusually strong governance ratings and an internal culture survey that showed employee trust scores had risen sharply compared to the years before its IPO. The article mentioned, briefly, an unnamed anchor investor whose intervention prompted early structural reforms, without further detail. I read it once, on a quiet morning, coffee cooling beside me, and felt the particular satisfaction of watching something built correctly hold its shape over time. Not the loud kind of satisfaction people imagine when they picture a wrongdoer publicly humbled. The quieter kind, the kind that comes from knowing a system now works a little better than it did before, for people who will never know your name. Vanessa Holbrook, I heard through channels unrelated to my own, had taken a much smaller advisory role at a regional nonprofit, work I understood to be genuine, if considerably less visible than the one she'd left behind. I didn't wish her further harm. I never had. The consequence I required wasn't punishment for its own sake. It was the structural change that made a repeat of that evening considerably harder for the next Vanessa Holbrook, who might otherwise walk into a room and assume the same things about the wrong person. Preston sent me a short note around the anniversary, a single line. The company is better for what happened that night. I understand that now in a way I didn't at the time. I appreciated the honesty of it more than I would have appreciated a longer, more polished statement. I filed the note away, the way I file most things, quietly, without much ceremony. in a drawer that holds 11 years of similar small confirmations that patience, applied consistently, eventually produces exactly the outcome it was built to produce. The wine stain never fully came out of that navy dress. I kept it anyway, folded at the back of a closet I rarely open, not as a trophy, but as a reminder of something simpler, that the moments people assume matter least about you are often the exact moments that end up mattering most. People sometimes ask me, when they finally learn the whole story, why I didn't simply announce who I was the moment that glass hit my face. It would have ended things faster. It would have spared me the wine stain, the whispers, the 15 minutes of standing quietly while a room full of strangers watched someone humiliate me and said nothing at all. I understand the question. I even understand the impulse behind it, the idea that power, once you have it, should be used immediately to correct any injustice the moment it appears. But I've learned something different over 11 years of building Colston Vantage Capital from a rented office above a dry cleaner into a firm that now holds meaningful stakes in companies most people recognize by name. The truth about how an organization treats people only reveals itself completely in the moments before anyone important is watching. The instant I announce my name, every uncomfortable truth in that room disappears behind performance. People start behaving for an audience instead of showing you who they actually are. So I wait. I always wait. Not because I enjoy the discomfort of those minutes. I don't. Not really. Not even after all these years. But because that discomfort is the only reliable window into what's actually true. Vanessa Hallbrook showed me everything I needed to know about Hallbrook Dynamics culture in 15 uninterrupted minutes. More honestly than any due diligence report my team could have produced in 15 months. That information became the leverage that made the company measurably better for everyone who works there now, long after the Gala itself was forgotten by everyone except the people it changed. I still wear plain dresses to events like that one. I still travel under names that mean nothing to anyone glancing at a seating chart. I still sit quietly at tables where people occasionally decide, within the first few seconds, exactly what kind of person I must be. If this story moved you, please subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss our next dramatic story. Tap like and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Thank you for watching.